So you shouldn't message that I'm recording the webinar. Just a few more notes about NPLAN before we get going. We're funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to provide legal technical assistance to communities that want to use law and policy to create healthier environments. We develop model policies and work with advocates and public health officials and school officials to understand how those policies might work in their communities and agencies. As part of childhood obesity prevention work, we look at how the school environment can be improved to promote student health. One way schools can promote student health is by making it easier and safer to walk or bike to school. Safe to School allows schools to actively encourage regular physical activity for kids, which can improve academic performance without taking extra time out of the school day. It supports these efforts by providing trainings like this one and one-on-one technical assistance to schools and Safe Routes to School advocates. We're developing a lot of materials on this topic. We currently have 2 fact sheets that discuss various issues with liability and Safe Routes to Schools program, which Sarah will be highlighting later in her presentation, and you can download right now at nplan.org. So you'll see the agenda up on your screen. We're first going to hear from Robert Ping of the Safe Routes to School National Partnership about an overview of the Safe Routes to School program and liability concerns that come up. And then Sarah will take over from there and give you a little bit of a liability 101 and thoughts about overcoming the fear of liability. And we'll hear from Robert Ping again with best practices for keeping kids safe in Safe Routes to School programs. And then we'll get some lessons from the field from Wendy Callens, who's with Safe Routes to School Marin County, and she provides a lot of technical assistance to people in the country, so she knows a lot about what's happening in this area. And then we'll get your questions, so be sure to submit those. So without further ado, I'll introduce Robert Ping. Robert is the State Network Director for the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. Robert was nominated to the National Safe Routes to School Task Force in 2005, and he was formerly the Safe Routes to School Program Director for Oregon's Bicycle Transportation Alliance and the Program Manager for Portland's Safe Routes to School program up in Oregon, which served 19 schools.
Welcome, everyone. Fine, Christine?
Yep, we can do it.
Okay, good. I'd like to talk about Safe Routes to School in context with liability. First off, why should we worry about this? Well, obviously, with the number of participants we have on today's call, there is a worry about this. There's the fear of crime issues, and from the school district's perspective, typically fear of lawsuits. They're getting involved in getting kids walking and biking because they're worried about their being sued, and of course they're concerned about the safety of their kids. I think risk-averse society in some respects, especially when it comes to walking and biking. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough risk aversion to cars and inactivity and even pollution. We're seeing things like this image, and this is at school in the southern U.S. There's a lot of danger from this kind of a situation. You can imagine kids trying to cross the street by foot or by bicycle. That's not going to happen anytime soon without some major changes. But there's a lot of risk to the folks that are in the cars there, too. And I think we allow that risk in our society a little too much, potentially, compared to bicycling and walking. And activity is a major issue because our kids, as everybody knows, our current generation is a little more protected than previous ones, and not allowed to run around crazy in the afternoons like we used to be. Those who were doing that in earlier generations. And so kids are tied into the video screens and at home and being protected in the back seat of the car, so to speak. But I think there's a lot more health consequences from that activity than there would from walking and biking to school. And then there's pollution. Cars and congestion cause air pollution. We're seeing rises in asthma rates and other things caused by environmental issues around traffic. So, as always, do we really think this is a better scenario than kids walking and biking? Shouldn't we get some of these cars off the road, see buses active and kids walking and biking more than this kind of a scenario? So it's all perception for the most part. we have a perception that walking and biking is dangerous, and it's, I think, considered more dangerous than being in a car. 60% of Americans in a poll say they would ride if they felt it was safer. So there are folks that would probably allow their kids to be out there if they felt that the infrastructure was better, that traffic behaviors were better, and that kind of thing. And there's really a lack of thought about the actual risks in society, the risks that we are allowing ourselves to take and the risks that we're not allowing ourselves to take. Unfortunately, biking and walking is considered inherently dangerous, and people aren't willing to take that particular risk, even though we do take risk with other things. The result, of course, is that we have a lot of health issues. I'm very happy to see the Safe Routes to School movement being joined by health practitioners and folks around the country, because I think we're seeing that the childhood obesity issues and the related symptoms, that heart disease and cancer and other health problems, easily eclipsing traffic safety dangers. In 2007, over 1 million people, adults and kids, died of heart disease and cancer, not counting any other related issues like diabetes. And now kids are getting type 2 diabetes, which used to be called adult onset. Crashes in 2007 accounted for 41,000 deaths. So that number has been dropping. So we're doing things right in traffic calming issues, building more awareness and that kind of thing. I think in 2008 we were down to 40,000, 2009 down to 39,000, and we're hovering around that at this point. And of course, the number one fear for parents is stranger abduction. On average, and this is an average number, not specific to 2007, there are 115 true stranger abductions in the U.S. each year. So statistically, it's the smallest issue, but it's the biggest fear. And I'm a parent, and I do worry about that myself. So we can't tell parents not to worry. They should be worried about that issue and teaching their kids how to deal with that instead of just locking them in the house or in the back of the car as a result. Unintended consequences. We've seen the growth of safe routes to school and walking and biking in general, active transportation, livable communities, smart growth, all those good initiatives that are getting people out and about creating communities to make them better for activity. But I think there are potentially some unintended consequences. Because walking and biking has been decreased over the last 34 years in the U.S., I should say among kids, the unintended consequence is that as Safe Routes to School comes along and as we start building that energy again, we're seeing principals, school districts, even city officials starting to work now as they see the increase, or as people walk into their offices talking about kids being out and about on the street. They're sorry about this, maybe more than they were before. So Safe Routes to School can actually solve some of those problems. So the issue is being able to convince the that people are starting to notice or think about walking and biking. So that's something we definitely have to deal with. We have officials unwilling to participate in Safe Routes to School programs. We're seeing principals, we're seeing school districts. People are noting that there may have been a policy in place that they didn't even know existed before that was against walking or biking to school. Potentially a school gets built in a new area and it's not being built for walking and biking, and the school officials determine that it's just too dangerous. Policies at the local level is critical to be able to solve those problems. Getting school districts to site schools in neighborhoods, or what we call the community-centered school, can alleviate some of those issues. The propensity of school districts to build mega schools on the edge of town in the last decades has made things worse from an infrastructure standpoint. It is harder to walk and bike to school when the school is at the edge of town or when it's built out into the woods like the first image we saw. Thing has been considered the safest travel option. Although sometimes we see a default from school districts to busing automatically because it's considered the safest. But if you consider health consequences, is it really the safest? We should be anti-bus because I think it's a far better approach than the automobile, single occupant automobile. And for some communities, there is no other option that's reasonable. For instance, rural communities or communities where there's a great distance between where the kids live and where they need to go to school. But districts pay a lot for busing, especially hazard busing or busing called courtesy busing, which might be within a mile or two of the school. This costs districts a lot of money, and those distances are ideal for getting kids walking and biking to school. Routes to School programs are focused on those distances close into a school, and there's where district administration can save money by not having to bus those close distances. Sometimes courtesy busing, even if parents are paying for service, they probably aren't paying for what it actually costs to run the bus and pay for the staff person, maintain the bus. They're able to get courtesy busing, and very often it's because there may be an arterial or some other dangerous situation, and the district feels they need to bus the kids. Here in a suburban community of Portland, there's an elementary school across the street from an apartment complex, and half of the kids that attend that school live in the apartment complex. The road is a two-lane. It's very fast. It's a downhill stretch with turns that are pretty much blind turns. And the school district has to bus kids across that street. To be able to fix that roadway for walking and biking would require probably $1 million overpass or something made like that, and they just don't have the budget for that. So we have to really look at policies at the local committees that prevent schools from being placed or streets being built in such a way that people cannot walk and bike around. Parents are often forced to drive children to school. When we saw the bus cost increase a couple of years ago, bus service was dropped in school districts, in some school districts, and the result is parents now need to get their kids to school. If they're worried about traffic issues or crime, they're going to default to driving. So we saw a lot of new cars showing up at schools where school districts cut out bus routes and didn't consider safe routes to school as an alternative because of liability fears or fears of crime and traffic safety. That increase in cars is going to increase some bad consequences. There's traffic dangers, pollution, congestion, and other risks from having a lot of cars in neighborhoods and cars approaching the school. So that is something that needs to be grappled with. It doesn't really match the realities out there. Safe routes to school can do a lot to change that, and I think we need to be proactive in our approach to liability and the very fears that are out there in approaching these. And I will talk a little bit later about some of the best practices that we feel could be taken by local communities to mitigate some of the liability risk and some of the fears that people might have.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
Robert. So we'll hear from Robert again in a few minutes after Sarah's presentation. But before we jump to that, I need to move us over to a quick poll. And from what I understand, it wouldn't be a safe route to school training or conversation without asking a couple of very common questions. So open up the poll on the right-hand side of the screen. You should see a place for you to respond. So we just have two questions. One is, how did you get to school as a kid? And then if you have school-aged children, how do they get to school? So we're just going to give you seconds. I know it says you have 5 minutes to answer, but you don't have 5 minutes. And while you're responding, looks like about 40% of you responding. I just want to note that we have over 300 participants on this call today, which is, I think, a record for us. And from what I understand, there are participants from all over the world, not just in the United States. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to give 5 more seconds to answer the poll, and then we'll have results for all of you. All right, poll. Looks like up to school as kids. Just going to wait for technology to catch up to us. All right. You should now be able to see the poll results. And it looks like the answer to the first question, it looks about half and same number of people walked as rode the school bus or rode in a private vehicle, and a small small percentage of you took public transit or biked to school. And now let's look at school-age kids. It looks like those of you who do have school-age children, the majority of you do, they take the school bus or they take a private vehicle, and a smaller percentage walk or bike to school. So those are very interesting numbers. And Sarah is going to take over the reins and talk about overcoming the fear of liability and getting more of those kids today out walking and biking. So Sarah?
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Zimmerman, and I'm a senior staff attorney here at NPlan. And I have been working on and researching safe routes to school issues and other issues related to active transportation for the past several years. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the legal background that hopefully will really help you understand better where the fear of liability comes from, what the reality of liability is, and how you can address it. Today, I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and I'm going to go into a little Tort Liability 101 overview. So I'm going to be talking about some different legal concepts as part of that, but really hoping you get from that section is not necessarily the ability to remember what the 4 elements of negligence are, even though I am going to review those with you. What I'm hoping people are going to take from that section is an understanding that you're only liable if you engage in negligence. And negligent if you act with reasonable care in something you do. So I'm keep reiterating that message throughout this presentation, but I just wanted to highlight that right off the bat here. After I get a general legal overview, we're going to go into talking about some of the defenses that are available for school districts, for nonprofits, and also for volunteers, and some of the specific things that are available there. Really, we're going to end by talking about some tips for specific safe routes to school situations like walking school buses and some other issues that may arise in the context of safe routes to school. So let's get by just talking about what the best way to avoid liability is. And you don't need a law degree to understand this idea, and you don't need to do any legal research to understand this idea. If you can prevent injuries from occurring in the first place, there won't be any liability. So the most important things that schools can do to prevent themselves from having liability for children who are walking and bicycling to school, and for children they might want to encourage to do that in the future, is to make it safer for kids to walk and bike to school. I'll illustrate this point. I want to tell you a story about something that happened down in Southern California, in Simi Valley. And this story, the story actually started about 40 years ago. And a principal at the local middle school had a hole cut in a chain-link fence that led onto a street. And he did this to create another entrance and exit to the school that would provide more convenient access to the neighborhood on the other side of the fence. However, when he did this, he didn't have any kind of safety consultation. And the crosswalk on the other side of this chain link fence was where it was hard for motorists to see when people were crossing the crosswalk, because it was kind of at the top of a hill, and they had a restricted line of sight. And by cutting this hole in the chain link fence, kids were diverted from a safer intersection where they could cross that was adjacent to the main entrance and exit to the school, and instead, a significant portion ended up using this hole in the fence instead. Now, over the next 20 years, this street became busier and busier. The speed that people drove on the street increased more and more, and for this time, there were many complaints. The school complained many times to the city, saying that this wasn't safe and they should do something about it. Parents complained to the school and the city, concerned about this issue. And unfortunately, these concerns weren't just abstract. In 1989, a 13-year-old girl was on her way to school, and crossing this crosswalk, she was hit by a car, she received serious head injuries, and she was permanently disabled. The district was subsequently sued by her family, and ultimately they were found liable for this injury. The reason that the court found liable, even though this wasn't on school property, was because the school was well aware of the fact that there was a danger here, and there were reasonable steps that they could have taken to minimize that danger, and they didn't do it. if a routes to school program had been in place in this school, in all likelihood, this injury never would have occurred in the first place. A safe routes to school program would have taken a systematic look at the ways that children were accessing school on the way to school and from school, and would have assessed the safety of the different routes and taken some action after identifying how dangerous this particular location was. Now, if this child had somehow been injured anyways because she decided to climb over this fence, or she walked all the way around the school to cross that crosswalk anyways, the school would, in all likelihood, not have been held liable for this situation if they had that safe routes to school program in place, because they acted with reasonable care. Even if injuries occur, there's no liability if you've acted with reasonable care. So hopefully, as we move into discussing some of the ins and outs of liability, you're going to gain some tools that help you avoid the situation where when someone raises the topic of liability, the conversation just ends. I am hoping that instead you'll understand and you'll be able to help others understand that that when the topic of liability comes up, that's the beginning of a conversation about risk management, about how we're going to avoid having injuries happen in the first place, and that safe routes to school is a key risk management tool that can help you decrease children's likelihood of injury and also decrease the likelihood of a school district or other entity being found liable. Let's jump into this Tort Liability 101 part of our presentation. What is a tort? You have guessed that a tort in this context is not a delicious chocolate dessert. A tort here is an injury that occurs to a person or to property. Now, there's a definition of a tort. This has to be an injury the law is going to deem worthy of compensation. Has to have occurred due to the fault of someone else. One thing that's important to know about torts is that torts are state law. So exactly what torts exist in a state, how exactly you go about proving them, what defenses may exist to them, all of these things may vary somewhat from state to state. And that's why we just emphasize the importance of talking with a lawyer who's licensed to practice law in your state if you're trying to get a really concrete answer to a question that you have. Good luck getting a concrete answer from a lawyer, even in your state. There's a lot of different kinds of torts out there. One kind of tort is battery. That's an intentional tort. If you came over and punched me in the chin on purpose, that would be battery. Another kind of tort is defamation or slander. That happens if I were telling people falsely that you had punched me in the chin, then I'd be engaging in defamation. But the kind of tort that we're talking about here is negligence. Now, one good thing about negligence is that unlike this idea of torts that doesn't really map onto any concepts that we talk about as a general matter in everyday conversation, the legal idea of negligence and the everyday way that we use the word negligence are actually very similar. And you can really use your kind of practical common sense understandings to help you understand what negligence is. So it's the same way if your neighbor failed to remove a big dead branch from their tree and it was half there year after year and then it fell in your car, you might say that your neighbor had been negligent. That's kind of the same way that the law is going to think about negligence. And the key to negligence is, has a person behaved with reasonable care in the situation in question? So you're required to behave with the utmost, most scrupulous and highest possible standard of care to avoid negligence. You have to behave the way an ordinary, reasonable person who was acting with reasonable care. I want to know about those 4 elements of negligence that I mentioned before, and I'm introducing this idea because I think this helps you see how we think about the different parts of negligence and move through thinking about the different considerations that go into whether or not negligence has occurred. And hopefully that'll help you understand a little bit better how this really works. So the first element of negligence is that there needs to be a duty. And school districts, for example, really have a duty to supervise and to act with reasonable care towards students while students are on the school campus or under school district custody or control. This becomes a complicated issue in the context of safe routes to school sometimes because children may not be on the campus, and there can be issues about whether or not the school district has a duty under the particular circumstances. is there needs to be a duty. Second, to be a breach of that duty, and what that usually is a failure to act with reasonable care. Third, need the element of causation. There needs the failure to act with reasonable care needs to have actually caused some of injury or damages. So there's those four elements. So the upshot of that, the really significant thing for you to take away from those four elements of negligence, the idea that there's no liability if any of those elements is absent. So the liability, unless you have a situation where someone failed to act with reasonable care, in addition, that carelessness caused the injury that happened. Now turn to something else that's helpful in helping people feel more calm and unperturbed about dangers of liability. And that's some of the important defenses that exist for school districts, to a lesser degree for nonprofits, and for volunteers. Other elements of negligence. Now, even if all the elements of a tort are present, you're not going to be liable for that tort if you can persuasively assert a defense. Example of battery before. If you came up to me and punched me on the chin, I want to sue you for battery. However, if you were able to show that the reason that you punched me on the chin was that you were acting in self-defense, because I come at you wildly waving a tort law casebook and mumbling things about liability under my breath, and you had felt in danger, and so you had acted in self-defense by punching me in the chin, then you would have a defense to battery, and you wouldn't be liable even though you had those elements. In negligence, in the context of negligence, the main defense that is really relevant is the defense of immunity. For districts, we call that immunity sovereign or governmental immunity. What that involves is that as a public policy matter, we've decided that there's going to be no liability for school districts under certain circumstances, even though each element of negligence is present. So it's really important to emphasize that this varies significantly by state. Some states have extremely strong and broad governmental immunity in play, and it's extremely rare in those states for states to ever be found, for school districts to ever be found negligent for anything, because almost all the time they're successful in raising immunity. In other states, immunity is available only very narrowly for school districts, and immunity in those states largely protects decisions that are sort of higher level discretionary policy decisions. And there's a lot of states that are somewhere in between, and this is very fact-specific and very case-by-case kind of information. But it's important to know that this defense of immunity is alive and well. It helps school districts avoid liability all the time. And in all states, it's highly likely to protect districts from liability when all they're doing is something like endorsing or sponsoring a program such as the Safe Routes to School program. In all states, doing that is going to be protected from liability by immunity. Many states, either implementing or running a Safe Routes to School program, may also be protected by immunity. And of course, you can also, school districts can also protect themselves by how they set up and run those programs, and by having insurance. What about nonprofits? Do they have anything like this idea of immunity? There's something available in a few states that is immunity. It's called charitable immunity. It is much less widely available, and sometimes it involves actual immunity. Sometimes states provide caps on damages for nonprofit organizations. And you happen to be a nonprofit operating in one of those states, it might be good for you to know about that. Volunteers. Volunteers have very robust protections from liability that I think it's good for people to know about. There is a federal law that was passed in 1997 called the Volunteer Protection Act. This law applies in all states other than New Hampshire, which chose to opt out of this act. However, New Hampshire and many of the other states have additional laws that also protect volunteers from liability. And what that is, it says that if you're a volunteer for a nonprofit or a school district or other governmental agency, and while in the course of your volunteer duties you either act negligently or are accused of acting negligently, you won't be liable. You're protected from liability. One important thing to know about the law is that it doesn't, however, protect the nonprofit that you're volunteering for, and they may end up being liable for the negligence that a volunteer under their supervision engaged in. We have a new fact sheet on volunteers and liability that goes into a lot more detail about the ins and outs of this law and when there's a few exclusions. But it's a pretty simple law, and so the fact sheet's able to summarize those issues pretty easily. So go look on our website and check that out if you're curious for more information. Let's step back a little bit. Having gotten that overview of a lot of these complicated legal concepts, how would you really think about approaching liability risk? I've developed a 3-step method that can help you approach liability risk. So first, step 1, relax. Liability risks are greatly exaggerated. We are all, in those of us who are in the United States at least, we are a lot of messages from our media and from advertising campaigns and various things that tell us that there's a liability epidemic, that liability is out of control, that people are constantly getting huge awards when they're suing over kind of frivolous matters. When we look at the research into what's really going on with liability lawsuits, we see those claims are really not accurate. Liability lawsuits haven't increased per capita over the last several decades. Most people who are injured due to someone else's fault, in fact, never file a lawsuit or bring any kind of a claim. They just kind of suck it up and go on with their life. Our legal system is fairly successful at weeding out frivolous or non-meritorious claims fairly quickly, although not necessarily quickly enough for the person who is being sued. And I think most significantly, we really, you frequently will open the newspaper and read a story or see the story right on the front page of the newspaper about someone getting a multi-million-dollar judgment or settlement in a case that just seems a little bit preposterous. You never open the newspaper and read that most lawsuits that are brought are settled for very small amounts of money, $5,000, or result in victories for the defense. So really important context that I think you need to bear in mind when you're thinking about liability. The dangers really aren't as large as you probably fear. And specifically in the case of Safe Routes to School, it's really worth emphasizing that there hasn't been a single case decided that involves an injury that occurred as part of a Safe Routes to School program. So we can take a lot of consolation from that. Now I just want to note briefly that these statistics are not going to help you out all that much. They're not going to make you feel that good if you happen to be that 1 in a million person who does get sued. And nobody can ever promise you that there won't be a lawsuit that people can sue kind of about just about anything. And so you do certainly need to bear that in mind. But I think nonetheless, this broader context that there's really liability risks are probably much smaller than you may fear is good to keep in mind. 1, relax. Step 2 is be responsible. And this is the basic idea I've been talking about throughout this presentation of reasonable care. If you act responsibly with reasonable care, then you haven't acted negligently, and you ought not to be found liable. So you follow sensible standard procedures and use reasonable care in setting up and running your Safe Routes to School program. Step 3 is a backup plan. Assurance, so that if you happen to be that 1 in a million person who does get sued, that is an event that is, somewhat stressing rather than really devastating. It really provides you with a backup plan and some comfort. Now, I want to mention here that we have heard from some of you that it's easier for us to say that you should have insurance than for you to actually be that confident that your insurance covers what you want it to, and that this is kind of a confusing issue. And so I want to let you know that we are in the midst of beginning some additional research into insurance so that we can really understand much more clearly what your average nonprofit insurance package is going to cover and help you to understand some of the ins and outs of that a little bit better. Having provided you with that 3-step way of really covering yourself and protecting yourself with regard to liability, move into a few tips for specific situations. So first, I'm going to talk about walking school buses, which are a very popular thing for Safe Routes to School programs to run. a walking school bus, you're going to want to screen, train, and monitor your volunteers. And what screening means can vary very significantly from community to community. Some communities want to, or may be required by law, to do background checks and really, want to engage in a full-fledged security screening. In other communities, screening your volunteers may just mean sitting down with them and making sure that you're weeding out anybody who seems like they don't appreciate the fact that there's undertaking to provide for the safety of children is a serious concern and that they need to take that seriously. In addition to screening, training, and monitoring volunteers, you also want to develop pedestrian safety rules and train kids on them and give them practical opportunity to practice pedestrian safety. And of course, if there are hazards on the routes that you're taking that can't be avoided, you want to figure out ways to adopt reasonable precautions to protect kids from those hazards. And anything from helping the kids modify their behavior so that they're safer around them to taking other kinds of steps. A little bit about some tips for acting with reasonable care when it comes to creating maps that have suggested routes on them. So we strongly recommend that you work with your city planners, your city transportation department to select those routes and to avoid hazards. They may well be aware of hazards that aren't immediately obvious just from doing a walk in the neighborhood, and they may be aware of future issues that are going to come up that could result in hazards as well. And by working with your city, you're forming a relationship that may help you get them to undertake infrastructure repairs that could make that route much safer. The second recommendation may seem like legal nitpicking, and in fact it kind of is legal nitpicking. I'd also recommend that you consider calling the routes recommended or suggested routes rather than safe routes. And the reason is you don't really want to create a situation where you're somehow implying or suggesting that you are guaranteeing these routes are safe. You promise that someone's going to be safe every time they're on these routes, but you can say that you're recommending them because they're better than the other routes. Might as well just have your language kind of match up with what your meaning really is. And then it's quite important to revise the maps that you've created if you learn of new hazards. You don't be in a situation where you're somehow encouraging or allowing people to rely upon information that says that there's not a hazard in a location once you know that there is a new hazard. So those are some tips to think about. Now, a variety of other things that you might also want to do related to these two specific situations and also related to safe routes to school and liability more generally. And we have a lot more specific tips in this fact sheet on liability that we've created called Safe Routes to School, Minimizing Your Liability Risk. And as I mentioned before, that's available on our website at www.nplan.org. You can just type in Safe Routes to School in a little text box, and you should be able to get that to come up. So, wait a second. Sarah, this is Christine, and I hate to interrupt you. Your presentation's been great, but Christine, you are interrupting me. Okay, well, I'm sorry about that, but I have a bunch of questions that I really want to ask that I can't get over, and I just thought this would be a good time. Oh, okay, shoot. I'm here. Okay, so this thing, oh, you even have slides. It's funny when you're in control how that happens. So the first thing is that walking seems really dangerous to me, and like I almost got hit by a bus on my way to work, and we're going to send kids out to walk to school by themselves. That's interesting. That can be a common perception, and I think that there's part of that that's accurate. Walking is more dangerous for both children and for adults who are out there on the street than it should be, and we certainly need to make sure that streets that we're building have sidewalks, that there's infrastructure at intersections to make sure that cars aren't going too fast and that pedestrians are safe in those locations. But at the same time, if you look at the statistics, walking is actually a much better way of getting to school and getting around than riding in a motor vehicle is. Motor vehicle injuries are the top cause of death for children over the age of 1, whereas walking accounts for fewer than 200 fatalities for kids who are biking to school each year.
I think I saw Robert's slides about that. So the thing that I is that school districts or schools are responsible for kids from the front door to the school door. Like I've heard about schools that punish kids for fights that happen on the way to school. So doesn't that mean that they're responsible for anything that happens?
Well, luckily for schools, they most certainly not responsible for everything that happens on the way from the kid's front door to the school, because you imagine how difficult it would be for schools to be responsible for children during that whole time, even though they're not directly there to supervise them. I thought I've heard people say this too, and I think part of what creates this misconception is the fact that districts sometimes are specifically authorized by state law to address any kind of misbehavior that may occur on the way to and from school. It is a state-by-state issue a little bit. And I think the other thing that may sometimes lead people to think that is when they hear about situations like the one that I described in the beginning of this presentation down in Southern California and Simi Valley, they think, oh, well, if the district was responsible for something that happened, even though it wasn't on school property, they must be responsible for that whole school trip. But that's really a misconception.
Okay, I promise I just have one more question. So I've heard about, a place where the school prohibited kids from bicycling to school. I think there was like a whole conversation on the Safe Routes to School mailing list about that this week. Is that true?
There are a few schools out there that have taken this really extreme step of banning kids from bicycling to school. And although this is, there's not really clear law on this question, it really appears that schools are going way beyond what they are authorized to do when they take this kind of step and try and ban legal, social, beneficial activities that kids might be engaging in outside of school. This is probably a question of how much authority the state law actually gives to schools. And so that's one of the first questions, and this varies a little bit by state. But there's also a constitutional issue here about whether or not parents should be allowed to decide how they want to raise their children, including how they want their kids to get around. And so schools are on really shaky ground, I would say, when they try and do this kind of thing.
Well, that's all that I have right now, but I think that a lot of our participants will have more questions that we'll take at the end. So I guess I'll let you get back to your presentation.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. I was about to finish up anyway, so that was a good time for you to jump in. I just want to sum up by saying that it's important when you're thinking about safe routes to school to think about balancing the benefits that you get from safe routes to school from the risks that you may see. And I think Robert did a great job of describing a lot of those benefits and how really substantial they are. And what I hope this presentation has shown you is that while there certainly is some risk in safe routes to school, as there is in everything that we do in life, those are risks that can really be managed and that can actually even make things safer for people by engaging in safe routes to school. And I want with a thought, which is that most of you who already are running safe routes to school programs or involved in such programs are probably already doing most of the things that you need to do in order to protect yourself against liability. Not doing those things because you will see the future and you knew what I was going to recommend in this presentation. Not doing them to protect yourself from liability. You're doing them because those are the things that you do to prevent kids from getting hurt. So certainly if there's things I've mentioned that you're not doing, go ahead and start doing those. But I suspect that most of you are already really on the right track because your highest priority is keeping kids safe. In order to protect my own self from liability, I want to just mention that a general presentation like this one is not a substitute for advice from a lawyer about your particular situation. There are a lot of state-specific issues involved in this kind of issue, and so it's important for you to talk to someone who's licensed to practice law in your own state if you're really trying to get, as I said, a somewhat more definitive answer about your situation. Other more general questions, though, that don't get answered in the course of this webinar, feel free to email me or call me at the contact information that's available here. And go ahead and look at our website and check out those fact sheets that we've got for you.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And I apologize once again for so rudely interrupting your presentation. That's okay. So we're going to go back to Robert and hear from him about some more best practices that that schools and Safe Routes to School programs can use. So, Bert, I'm passing the ball to you.
Great. Right. So what can we do about liability? We've just heard some great legal analysis of the situations that we are commonly into. So let's talk about some specific steps. And by the way, I've been enjoying some of the questions people have been posing too. That's a great conversation. Talk to the school, talk to the city, find out what they're thinking. Before you start bringing up liability issues, interview the principal or superintendent's office, or if you're working with the city administrator, or whomever might be your primary contact, and tell them about Safe Routes to School and kids walking in general, and find out what their feelings are. Are there walking and biking policies already? Hold some pro-biking walking policies or Safe Routes to School specific policies in the district or the city, and you'll be able to find out if there are already some no biking or walking policies in place already. I usually recommend not talking about liability unless the subject is already brought up. So by doing this Q&A with the school officials or the city officials, you may be able to find out from what they're already thinking. If they are pretty laid back about it, then I wouldn't bring up liability. Just let it go and get the program started. You can deal with fears later, but Safe Routes to School really is a technique for making things safer, and that ultimately should be your statement to folks. But liability is already an issue, then I would suggest having meetings with people and start talking through some of the issues they're having and why they feel it's an issue and what fears they might have around kids walking and biking, and put people together to start talking about the solutions. Hazards. So you may find out about some of these when you're talking to school officials or parents or others in the community. Now you need to find out what the real hazards actually are and what may need to be dealt with in a Safe Routes to School program. So put together a school team. Even more, even if you're working with just a single school, I always recommend going to the community level and setting up some sort of community-wide task force. There's a number of good reasons for doing that. You can get the power brokers at the table, like a police chief or superintendent of schools, somebody who represents the mayor or city council, the big decision makers who can change policies in an instant, who can get more financial resources, who can make changes to infrastructure, things like that. Public works or police officers could be sitting right in the room and make changes on the phone while you're having a meeting. I've had that happen to me before. So having those folks in the room can make a big difference and can actually get policy change to take place if that is one of your issues. Conduct a walkabout. Invite the city engineer, public works, school principal, parents, and kids to do a walkabout and study what the actual hazards are around the school, especially the areas that cars and walkers and bikers and buses use to approach the school. There may be one more point of contact for people to come into the school. And every principal that I've ever talked to has felt that they had an issue with what they call the pickup and drop-off, or arrival and departure scenarios around the school. So definitely talk to them about that. Only a handful of principals I ever talked to felt like that was a smooth process, and even most of those were thinking cars and buses and not walking and biking. So it's good to bring those folks on board, do a walkabout, and see what is going on with safety around the school area. Walkability or bikeability audit. There are some good tools online for that. There's some standard forms that people are using for doing these. They're quite able to do. They're just a technique while doing your walkabout, or if you're doing it solo, just to study what's going on using these tools to find out what issues you have, what hazards you may have, and what opportunities you might have, trails and other ways for kids to get to school by walking or biking. And that are planned. There's been some question about mapping. And yes, mapping, as Safe Routes to School programs increase, so do concerns around mapping. There have been some communities that the cities specifically have not wanted to do maps because they feel they might be held responsible if anything happens if they said this is the safe route to school. The term Safe Routes to School was already addressed earlier, but and some communities have tried to change that. Here in Portland, Oregon, they changed it to Safer Routes to School. However, the acronym is commonly known now, especially now that there's federal funding. So as much as you can, stick with it, because name recognition and branding is an important piece of this too, and promoting programs. But mapping is a good tool. I've seen mapping increase numbers of people walking and biking simply because a parent heard that experts said that this is a decent route to walk and bike to school. It also changes perceptions. Parents, drivers, they may only think of arterial roads and freeways and may not even have a clue that a block over from their house is this quiet, beautiful, tree-lined street with sidewalks that the kid could walk down. They would just need to walk a block away, and the parent has never gone down that street. It may sound silly, but that is a very common scenario. I had a parent here in the hills of Portland living in a beautiful area with a giant park in between their house and the school, and she wanted to start walking her 9-year-old daughter to school, but was nervous about having to go through a park. She didn't think her daughter would want to cross the little stream, and she was worried about safety. She was mostly worried about her daughter not wanting to do it. So I had to convince her that, yes, your 9-year-old daughter is probably going to love walking through the park to go to school. They didn't have to cross any arterials. The next morning, the mom called me and said, I couldn't believe how much fun my daughter had walking to school, especially I couldn't get her out of the stream. She wanted to cross it over and over and over. So the mom was just used to driving on these big arterial roads in the neighborhood and had no idea that you could even walk through a park and use that as a transportation corridor. Bicyclists who ride regularly often understand that there are many routes for bicyclists that cars cannot even consider. And often people don't know that at the end of the cul-de-sac there's a cut-through, and you can save a mile roundabout by going through the cut-through on a bike or walking that you can't do in a car. So I also recommend doing walkabouts to do it on foot or on bicycle and not in a car, because you get a totally different perspective. If your city community does not want to do a map, they have the choice to not do that, especially if they're the funding organization for your program. If not, you can do a map if it's a volunteer-led program or led by a local nonprofit or even the school district. If an authority doesn't want to do a map and they're the ones sort of behind the program, then of course they have the right not to do the map. Ways to get around that by working in the schools directly or doing promotional campaigns and getting parents to learn about routes by doing things like walk and bike to school day and other techniques, and get around the mapping issue. One other point on mapping is that I've often seen maps created that listed every single type of street crossing in the entire neighborhood. And the map just looks like a collection of dots and dashes and lines, and it's very confusing to a parent. May be very obvious to those of us who do this kind of work, but to an average parent, it just may be more confusing and not a useful tool. Think of maps as a wagon wheel approach. You've got the school at the center of the map, and you draw lines on what you think with your school team and your experts are safest or safer or suggested routes to the school. And try to focus people onto particular streets. That way you've got safety in numbers too, especially if you're doing a walking school bus program where you're creating a group of kids walking with adult leaders. They have a prescribed route anyway, and so that process should take place. Study your hazards, come up with a plan, and your plan should consider the E's, and we normally have 5 E's. I'm not going to talk about evaluation today, not necessarily a safety issue, but I'll talk the other 4 E's. Make sure that even if one of these E's is not something you'll approach with your program, make sure that you've sat down with everyone involved, your community representatives, your city and school district, your parents and kids, and go through all of these to just make sure that you really understand what is needed in the community. Somebody in an office somewhere or a parent sitting at home is not going to have enough information to make decisions about which direction the Safe Routes to School program should go. Due diligence includes bringing the community together and the decision makers and stakeholders and parents and kids to the table to find out what they're thinking. Typically, we're doing things like a parent survey or an in-class student tally to find out what the parents and students are thinking, because ultimately it's the behaviors that you want to change if you want to do an increase in mode shift, or it's their perceptions around safety that you want to get to if they're noticing that there are problems. So engineering is the science and sometimes art of improving infrastructure in the neighborhood between where people live and where they're going to, in this case schools. And so engineering is a very critical piece, can also be the most difficult piece because we've been designing our communities around the automobile, and getting automobiles to go as fast as possible through our communities, your particular neighborhood around the school might have a lot of work to do to get the infrastructure to the point where you can walk and bike. There may be no sidewalks. There may be a combination of no sidewalks and arterials to cross. If that's the case, then apply for federal Safe Routes to School funding through your state program. Look for local funding, and remember that's going to take time. If there is funding available immediately, it's going to take a year to 2 to 3 years to get an infrastructure change made. And if it's a infrastructure change that could cause a lot of problems from a public standpoint or a lot of engineering work, it could take up to 10 years to get an infrastructure change made. But get started and see what is necessary. And remember that a particular crossing may take a huge amount of money and effort to fix. Maybe there's one a block away that could be used instead. Instead of having to spend a lot of energy on a particular crossing, look at other possibilities. And even if it's slightly more out of the way, it's better kids walking, and another block is only going to take another minute or so to get across. So engineering, a lot of best engineering techniques are the cheapest. Things like trimming hedges on corners for better sight lines, striping, and fixing signs and painting that are already there but it may be in disrepair. One of my favorite stories is in a presentation on Safe Routes, the Public Works Director was on his cell phone. I thought he was being rude. He was actually calling his trucks, and by the time we did our walk about a half an hour later, they had already started replacing signs that were missing because we brought it up in the meeting. It hadn't been on his radar screen. Another reason to bring in a city engineer, planner, those types of folks in public works into your school team so that they can hear directly from parents and students and others, and they can give professional advice on what is possible, is doable quickly, what is going to be long-term, and what the estimated costs might be for ideas that come up in a school team meeting. Some Q&A has been happening already on this forum about enforcement, and yes, please bring police officers into the approach. It's important to have them there. They are the ones that truly understand behaviors, driving behaviors, and criminal activity. But I caution people to make sure to talk to police officers before you bring them into a meeting to make sure you know where they're coming from. Because if a police officer really understands crime and activities, they'll understand that a multi-use path is going to really improve things in the neighborhood. But sometimes an officer may come in and just create a lot of extra fear, talking about the potential for extra crime. So make sure your police officer gets it before they get into the meeting. And also at the community level, bring in your police chief or somebody at the commander level to come in and provide that perspective. And they also can leverage resources. They can assign officers to a neighborhood. If they're finding out from you that there's going to be an increase in kids walking or biking on a particular route, they might start to do more enforcement on that route and slow traffic down, put in a speed trailer, write tickets, whatever they need to do, or just monitor, especially on a promotional event like Welcome Back to School Day, just to monitor safety. Having patrol cars there will change the driver's behaviors crazy. I had an event where I stood at the front of the school on Welcome Back to School Day. We had a whole bunch of walking school buses coming at us at once. I noticed a police car on every major street approaching the school, just sitting. And driver behaviors were the best I had ever seen in that neighborhood. Encouragement. This, to me, is one of the most important aspects. If you're in a suburban community where you have low numbers of walkers or bikers, to increase those numbers, we need to inspire parents to get out there and see that it actually feels a lot safer than it may have been in their minds beforehand. Also, walking school bus or biking train is a very important tool for improving safety because you have safety in numbers. Having adults monitoring the kids' activities, walking with them, guiding them across the street, and that can include crossing guards, very important. And there could be volunteers that just stand in their yards or corner captains. Just having adults out monitoring, more eyes and ears, will not only help the kids be better, but it actually will help calm traffic down too. Those encouragement programs like a walking school bus are critical for a Safe Routes program. Education. Teaching kids bike and pedestrian traffic safety is important because ultimately if you're going to have them out on the street, they need to understand safety issues. There are resources out there in curricula for education education programs. The National Partnership is working on an education document that'll help sort of divide some of that up. There's a whole bunch of things out there. We expect that to be done in the next 6 months to a year, and it'll be a pretty good document to describe education components. But in the meantime, you can do web searches and find out what is already out there. Diligence. So if you have a plan, follow the plan, implement, make sure you're doing something on each aspect of the plan. The plans show how each hazard is being addressed, and if it's not, how you're avoiding the hazards. For instance, if a bad crossing exists, your plan should say that you're going to route a walking school bus a block over and use a different crossing. You cannot ever guarantee safety. The best you do is make things safer and implement things that will reduce risk, but you're not going to make the world a safe place. There is risk in everything we absolutely ever do. So we just need to do the best we can. Make it the program can be voluntary. If the school district or city is nervous about sponsoring because of liability fears, then just make it a volunteer-led program. If you have a nonprofit group or a bunch of parents, let them sponsor it, and then the city and school can feel like they're off the hook. The school is responsible. If they sponsor a walking school bus, they will feel the need to put a teacher into the walking school bus. The good part that is if they do, their insurance will cover it as if it's a field trip. So that's a good thing. Most schools won't have the resources to have teachers walk and bike with the kids. Teachers can do it voluntarily, off duty, which is also very helpful because a lot of parents are more willing to walk with kids that know there's a teacher present who can deal with behaviors, etc. And parents can simply opt in or not. Safe Routes to School ultimately is a program that doesn't mandate anything necessarily. We hope that people get inspired to join. That's the best way to pitch your program, and parents can opt in or not. Over time, a successful walking school bus will start influencing the peers. The parents will stare out the window every day and notice that it's going really well, and they might want to participate. Insurance. You may consider insurance. You may want to talk to your school district or city about that. Ask if insurer will cover activities. Potentially they can. Particularly your local bike club or the city or somebody's existing insurer may cover it. I've heard stories where it's not a big deal for the insurer at all. I've also heard the flip side, some insurers just knee-jerk reaction was no. So check on that. If you feel that's necessary for insurance, then check around with your risk management people at the school district, with the city, whomever you're working with, and find out if that's an option. It'll be a very small increase for them to do it. It may be quite worth it for them. It may not be necessary, especially on a public street. The schools don't own the public streets, the cities do. So if a school is nervous about that, it shouldn't be so because the city owns those streets and sidewalks. The school isn't responsible for infrastructure that's off their campus. School district. Right, a few examples. And Christine, how am I doing for time? Are we over? Should I move quickly?
You can start to wrap up.
Okay. Doing very quick case studies. Here in Portland, Oregon, when I was starting up the Safe Routes to School program, I was very nervous about liability. I'd been hearing about that from several places. So I approached the school district CFO and risk management people, put a team together, came in with our information and facts and figures ready, and we sat down at the table and they said, why are you bothering us? This is not a big deal. We walk and bike in this town all the time. We're enjoying it. Just behind what the city is doing. Let's not worry about that. So that was great. Then we started working in the schools, and we had principals that popped up who were too nervous about kids walking, biking for safety reasons and liability reasons, and they didn't allow walking or biking. One elementary school principal, we get him to change his mind. He reluctantly joined the program. We did education classes, and we did an organized walking school bus. He was able to see that we were controlling the safety aspects for the kids and teaching kids safety. The parents were so enthusiastic about the education classes, as were the kids, that his mind is now a strong supporter of safe routes. Middle school principal had a no biking, walking policy. We got him on a walk and bike to school day event. He saw that, wow, it doesn't feel as dangerous as I thought. He changed his mind also. We did death in rural Oregon in 2004 or 5, I believe it was. A girl was walking down a street with no sidewalks, which they had done historically forever since this town was formed 100 years ago. SUV hit her. The next day, 150 cars showed up at the school. The Department of Transportation painted a double stripe down the middle of this basically one-lane road because they were freaked out about liability. But the end result was I got a phone call because the school district wanted to start a Safe Routes to School program because they realized there is some solution out there. There was no lawsuit, and it actually had the opposite effect than people thought. We actually were able to get a Safe Routes to School program going there to start dealing with where kids were walking. We found some opportunities to put in a trail. There's now money for putting in a multi-use trail so those kids in that neighborhood don't even have to deal with cars. That would have happened if they hadn't brought us down to present to the school district and get this program going. And folks have probably heard about the no biking policy at Maple Avenue Middle School in Saratoga Springs. This is a picture of the school. It was not designed for walking and biking, even though the town has won an award for being a livable town that promotes walking and biking. A very strong mom rode her bike to school on bike to work day, and the school principal and a state trooper actually impounded the kid's bike, made her drive back to pick it up. So she went to town, so to speak, on the school board. The partnership got involved, as did Newt Gingrich, because it was a freedom for him, and he's worried about childhood obesity. So a lot of folks got involved, and the school board has since changed their policy. It took one mom to get that started. So it can happen for you in your local community if you have struggles with that. And that's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you. You have such great stories, and we really appreciate you sharing them with us. Okay, now we are going to turn to some more real-life examples. We are very fortunate to have Wendy Callens with us, who I'm going to pull up her picture here, who is the founder and program director for Safe Routes to Schools in Marin County, which is one of the first Safe Routes to School programs in the country. It was established in the year 2000 and was selected this year by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to be a national suburban model for Safe Routes to School. When the author of the National Safe Routes to Schools Toolkit, which was published by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to create a way for communities throughout the United States to more easily launch Safe Routes to School programs. She provides training and consultation nationwide for programs interested in starting a Safe Routes to School program and has been a featured speaker on this subject at dozens of conferences and webinars like this one, nationally and internationally. So I'm just going to get her and Robert unmuted here, and we're going to do a slightly different format for this. Sarah and Robert have prepared questions for Wendy that she'll answer based on her consultation experience with many Safe Routes to School programs in the country, and we're going to immediately transition into Q&A with the audience. So we've taken down a bunch of your questions, and we'll field those out to Sarah, Robert, and Wendy. So go ahead.
This is again. I just want to really thank Wendy for being here. She has really probably the longest experience working on these issues of anybody in the country who's working on it, and has just a tremendous wealth of experiences and skills and thoughts about all this. So we wanted to present you guys with the opportunity to ask her some questions, and we thought we would just jump in by asking some ourselves to get things started. So I wanted to ask you, do you have specific recommendations for people if they're encountering fear of liability from school officials?
Well, I think Robert really addressed that very well in his presentation, and so did Sarah. When I first started the program, one of the first things I did is I contacted a risk management specialist. And notice I say risk management and not a lawyer, because there is a difference. And lawyers, essentially are either a risk, let's not do it. Risk management understands, as Sarah so well put, that you balance the benefits against the risks. And if a program provides enough benefits, then showing due diligence, as Sarah said, that is what protects you against liability. And I would say, the thing about, instead of saying protecting against liability, I think what we have to protect against is fear of liability. And fear is something that needs to be conquered. And conquer fear through developing skills and having information good information at your fingertips. And so knowing what the law is and knowing what's real as opposed to those myths that, Christine, you were asking Sarah about, and the difference between them, armed with that, you can conquer the fear of liability by presenting the facts as they actually are.
Wendy, so I'm imagining I'm a Safe Routes practitioner, and I'm inspired to start a Safe Routes program. I've just called a meeting with the school superintendent and a principal, and we're sitting down at the table, and I've given my little presentation, and they're curious the assurance I can give them that there is no risk associated with Safe Routes to school. What would be a good response to that?
Yeah, and you know, as we've said earlier in the presentation, there's no such thing as no risk. You can't assure anything is absolutely perfectly safe. That goes to everything in life. And so the answer to that is you have to address the risks and address the hazards through the processes of Safe Routes to Schools by evaluating the streets, identifying the hazards, and coming up with a plan to address those hazards, by teaching the kids out how to walk and bike safely, by having driver's education programs, all the things that encompass a full-board Safe Routes to Schools program is how you address what those risks are, and you outwit with the benefits, because by having the Safe Routes to Schools program, you actually are instituting a risk management program in your school.
Really interesting, Wendy. Can you maybe just answer one last question for me before we open it up to everybody? Ask you, I have noticed in the course of exploring this that schools seem to be perfectly willing to accept the risk that's associated with sports and field trips and just having a whole batch of kids running around their school every day, but they really frequently do raise this question of risk and liability in the context of Safe Routes to School. Can you provide any insight into why that is?
I think what we're talking about is what's culturally acceptable and what is not culturally acceptable. As saw by the survey, when most of us were growing up, it was culturally acceptable to walk to school. As a matter of fact, it was what was expected of us. So no one thought twice about whether there were risks involved of kids walking to school. Well, these days, getting in a car is considered culturally acceptable. Playing sports is considered acceptable. But walking and biking is now on the outs. And the whole purpose of Safe Routes to Schools is to bring it back into cultural acceptance and making it the normal thing to do. And so I think that's why, when it comes to sport, and I find it very interesting when it comes to stranger danger, because when you actually look into the issues around child predators, there's far more risk involved in family members and, what scandal with the churches and what has happened, what lifeguards and coaches, and that's where you see the predators cropping up. And as was pointed out very early, there are fairly few stranger abductions that actually take place. Our job really is to shift the cultural acceptance that walking and biking is something to do. And it works all the way from the adults down to the children. And, when it comes to kids in other countries, like in Holland, they wouldn't be caught dead. If they're a teenager, they wouldn't be caught dead in their parents' cars. Oh, my God, I'm not a little kid. Why should I be in my parents' car? I can bike on my own. And therein is the goal of where we want to reach for Safe Routes to Schools.
All right. Thank you. So we're going to keep all of your lines open, and we've gotten a ton of questions. So I'm going to just start throwing them out there. And for the audience to know, it's just to do a quick time check, it's about 11:15 here on the West Coast, and we're going to answer questions right through 11:30, and then we'll cut things off. So I have a whole list here that'll probably take us right up through there, but keep sending them in, and we'll try to pull some of the more recent ones as well. So Wendy mentioned in the response to the first question from Sarah that she talked about a good experience working with a risk manager, but one of our participants asked what we think the role of a risk manager typically is. Is it to avoid all risks and just completely eliminate anything that might bring risk to the school, or are they more working towards minimizing risk and working with the school district still allow things that may bring risk to the school. So that one is for any of you or all of you to take.
Why don't you take that first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that most risk managers do understand, their very title has the notion of managing risk in it, that they're accustomed to seeing there's risk in almost everything they're doing, and so that their training, their orientation really generally is and should be around how you manage risk, how you minimize it, how you use different strategies, including insurance, including what kind of practices you use, a variety of things to manage risk. But I'm not surprised to hear that you may occasionally encounter someone out there who thinks that in the case of Safe Routes to School, it's an idea and it really stumps them, and they feel like they shouldn't get involved with risk at all. And I'd say that if you're trying to work to bring someone from that perspective to the other kind of perspective, you might want to go in both armed with some statistics about, actual risk of routes to school compared to actual risk of other things that a school may be involved with. And they also want to get some allies for yourself in your community. So if you can get any other school board personnel or principals on board with you, if you can get your city council interested, your Department of Transportation, anyone like that, I imagine that having both the facts and also some political pressure might help change that perspective.
Robert or Wendy, do you want to add anything, or should we take the next question?
I'll reiterate that the role of a risk manager is not to avoid all risk, but to manage risk in the ways in which Sarah explained, showing due diligence and showing that you're taking sensible standard procedures to address risks.
One related point that oftentimes the school principal is worried about their community at large, their teaching community, their parent and student community at large. If they feel that there's some impetus, some momentum behind the people that are sitting in their office pitching safe routes to school, they'll be a lot more willing to consider it, especially, as was mentioned, you had officials and others who can take some of the responsibility with them. In other words, the people that are responsible for the roads and sidewalks would be in the room, and also parents and children, showing that, yes, we want this. It's worth the risk. That will help move the program forward.
Great, thank you. This one, I think, is for Sarah, but others feel free to weigh in. Is there a difference in liability for the school if the Safe Routes to School program is coordinated by a volunteer versus a grant-funded coordinator?
There may be a difference in liability, and this is to get into some of those issues that may end up varying by state and varying by exactly how you have things set up. As I was explaining before, if you have a program where the main role that the school is playing is just to sponsor and permit the Safe Routes to School program from going on, then the school's liability in that situation is going to be quite limited, particularly if the volunteers are sort of associated with a nonprofit organization of kind that's clearly running the program. So in that situation, if the school was funding a coordinator, the school would then be moving into that sort of category where they're implementing a program, and they'd likely be taking on some additional risk, although they'd also be able to actually control how the program was being run a little bit more. If they had that volunteer working for the school in a similar capacity to the funded coordinator, there wouldn't really be any difference in that situation. The volunteer would still be under the auspices of the school. And there really do start being some pretty state-specific issues here. There are states in which the school's immunity is so broad that it even covers volunteers who or employees of the school. And so it really makes sense in those states to have all of the functions located at the school, if at all possible, because that minimizes everybody's liability. There are other states in which that might really not be comfortable for the school, and there wouldn't be that benefit of moving the immunity on.
And so several questions where folks wanted us to clarify the liability laws in their state. Can you just comment a little bit about how they can access that type of information?
Well, I'm afraid to say that is indeed something of a challenge. In order to understand how the law works sort of at a national level, we had to delve into the law of a bunch of states in a great deal of detail. And sadly, because liability law is something that's kind of evolved over time, there's like one statute that you can go to look at that will just summarize the what is in your state. There's not one place you can go. You really have to like sort through cases, do what a lawyer does. So in order to understand that with regard to your particular state, I would recommend that you see whether there's some lawyer who has in this area and authority over this area, such as, for example, a school board lawyer or a lawyer who may be associated with your state school board association. Hopefully that's a person who might already have a lot of understanding of what kind of immunity you have in your state, and will be able to help you think through some of the issues about how to structure a program.
The good find lawyers like that would be through your local bike clubs, walking clubs, or other groups like that where folks might have a strong enough interest to want to get involved in as parents at the school. There's different channels you can use to find those folks.
Well, I also want to mention for, especially those who are from nonprofits or bicycle organizations, the League of American Bicyclists, if you become a member, offers insurance for when you have bicycle events or field trips that you might want to look into.
Thanks for this. So another question that came in was, what do you guys think about schools requiring kids to wear helmets when they bike to school?
Strong opinion on this, so maybe I'll jump in to start out with, and then I'm really curious to hear what Wendy and Robert have to say too. I think that schools should most certainly strongly encourage children to wear helmets. But I think that schools want to be in a position where they're claiming the mantle of enforcing whether or not kids are wearing helmets when they're on their way to and from school. I think schools sort of make some sort of claim that they're going to make sure that kids do that and they're going to enforce it, and then they end up not, they're dealing with some other matter. They see a kid go by without a helmet. They don't do anything about it. That's the kind of situation where I think they may have increased their risk by making that kind of statement. So I think it's good for them to keep a role clear that they try and encourage and educate, but they're not trying to become the traffic police and require kids to wear helmets.
Well, wearing a helmet is the law. It certainly is in California for any child under 18. So I'm not sure if I see Sarah's point on that, but I also think that it's important for children to be wearing helmets, and any way the school can encourage it or would be helpful. And especially just to point out, if it is the law in your state, you should point out it is the law.
Tricky subject in the U.S. There are some very, very strong opinions about helmets out there, and you'll find them as you do the program. In North and some of the places that have been designed well, people don't wear helmets because they don't really need to, and their traffic safety numbers are the best in the world, and nobody wears a helmet. Here, we feel we need to wear helmets because the traffic safety issues aren't great, especially younger grades. Kids in elementary school just don't have the physical developmental capabilities to along on a sidewalk and not just fall over sometimes and need a helmet for that. So I agree with Sarah that we shouldn't have a school mandating helmet use because they're going to fail at it. They're not going to be able to catch every kid who's not wearing a helmet, and that might be making them liable to it. But we should very strongly encourage through our program activities, and the schools should strongly encourage helmet use, especially if there's state law. Here in Oregon, it's 16 and under for helmets. And then another point about helmets is that kids need to know how to wear them correctly. As you have seen, kids will wear them way back on the back of their heads, their foreheads exposed, the helmet's not doing its job, and the kids don't want them in their way. So again, education piece of Safe Routes to School, one of the most important pieces of that education program is helmet fitting and teaching kids the proper way to put on a helmet. And then a very quick rant about helmets. There are types of helmets, and hopefully you can try to make your kid wear a helmet, but they go around the corner and ditch it in a bush or stick in their handlebars, and we've all seen kids riding around with helmets hanging off their handlebars or back on their heads. They're useless or dangerous. But there are that kids do wear, for instance, snowboarding. Kids are all wearing helmets snowboarding. It just has become the culture. The multi-use helmets, and I know I'm going to get flack from a bicyclist out there, the multi-use helmets are not necessarily designed strictly for bicycling, but if it's a difference between a kid wearing a helmet and not wearing a helmet, if you can get a cool helmet on their head like a nutcase helmet, something with designs, they can put stickers on them, which you're not supposed to do because the shell won't slide correctly. But again, it's the difference between wearing a helmet and not wearing a helmet is critical. And if you can get kids to wear helmets by having them do the cool X Games snowboard style multi-use helmet rather than the geeky helmet that their mom and dad wears, that can make the difference.
Perfectly acceptable in NPLAN webinars. So another question comes from one of our participants about this relationship between the school and the city in running a Safe Routes to School program or setting one up. So what are recommendations for the school forming a relationship with the city through the Safe Routes to School program and working with the colleagues?
Or you want to start?
Yeah, I was going to say, Robert, you start that.
Okay. I feel very, very strongly about having the authorities collaborating. And so as I mentioned earlier, the community-wide task force, or at least sitting people down at the table and having them openly collaborate is critical. From a policy standpoint, Safe Routes to School programs can only be so successful if there are good policies behind them. Or bad policies in the you're going to really struggle with your Safe Routes to School program. A good example would be you're getting a Safe Routes to School program going at a school and it's going great and you've been at it for a couple of years, and then the school district decides to consolidate and that school gets closed. All your work except for the education pieces are now out the window. If you had been involved in that local policy work or had the school district and city sitting at the table together, you might have gotten into that beforehand and been able to either move the program on or do something different or be part of the policy solution in your community to change. Very often the school district is working in a bubble from a policy standpoint, where they decide to locate schools, they decide to consolidate, bringing charter schools. Somebody had asked about that. There are a lot of charter schools, magnet schools, where parents have the choice of sending their kids other places. Those have a big effect on Safe Routes to School in the community. And so the more you or others can get involved in local policy change and even statewide policy change, that can make a big difference in your local area.
And what I would add is, from my experience, because we have a number of different small communities here in Marin, and those communities that have really stepped up, and the cities that actively participate in the task force and aggressively pursue funds and really make the changes on the ground, that is where we're seeing the greatest increase in children walking and biking to school. So there's a direct correlation between the participation of the city and the success of the program.
Okay, well, we're out of time. I just want to thank Dee and Robert for sharing their wisdom with our audience, with us. And I just want to make a plug for our next webinar, which is quite a departure from this topic, but probably of interest to some of our audience. We'll be talking about sugar-sweetened beverage taxes and fees, which is a very hot topic around the country right now. And that will be on September 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern. Our registration form will be up at nplan.org next week. And I want to remind folks that you'll be receiving an email after the webinar with a link to our survey. So please fill out the survey so that we can get your feedback on how this webinar went for you. And I think that's it. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on the next webinar.